own vision of the future? The answer is you won't find those people. You'll find people who agree with you 64% of the time and disagree 36. You'll find people who agree with you half the time. You choose in politics always the lesser of all evils.
Thank you so much for tuning into Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast. I'm your host, as always, Christian D. Evans. And guys, we have a very special guest on today. We always are big on impact, making an impact and making an influence. But what's so funny and what's so interesting is there's some individuals that I've had and talked offline that when they've scaled and had an exit, you got all these resources and now you want to give back, maybe at a political level. But sometimes we don't want to get in the spotlight of things, and that's the reason why we have this next guest on. See, not only has he been able to climb the mountain, but he's able to turn around and help others climb the mountain as well, right, in significance. And now he's able to impact at a very high level in the political world, but in a different kind of vertical. And that's the reason why I wanted to have him on. Now, just to share with you a little bit about his background is incredible, and I'm just going to share just a little bit of his amazing background. He's the managing partner at Beekman Advisors, which provides strategic advisory services to companies and investors involved in real estate, mortgage finance, affordable housing, and related sectors. He's also the co-founder for the Remergent Communities Fund, an opportunity zone fund focused on small towns and cities in the Southeast U.S. He also serves as a chairman of Papillon Capital, focused on sustainable infrastructure investing. Prior to Beekman Advisors, he was a managing director of Prudential Mortgage Capital, company one of the nation's leading provider of commercial mortgage financing. Now, he's a former chairman and commissioner for the Virginia Housing Development Authority. Previously, he has also served as the member of the Board of Housing Community Development in Virginia and as a commissioner on President Obama's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And we are so excited about having him on. He's in the philanthropy, he's in political, but he's also going out there making a huge impact in today's world. Please welcome my next guest, Shekar Narasimhan. How are you today, Shekar?
I'm doing great, Christian. Thank you for the great intro.
Well, I'm excited about having this conversation, and I really want to unpack. I was trying to figure out where we want to, start, and I was thinking about this before our podcast, and I was like, you know what? I'd love to get your journey. You've been able to scale a lot of businesses, had amazing stuff going on, and success. But what I found interesting is, at what point in your that next part of journey, where you started looking back and say, okay, I want to make an impact. And you started getting into more of that philanthropy and more political or more of that impact side of things. Shekar, help me understand at what point in that journey, in that time frame, where did that really start resonating and that started becoming your mission of that vision of your life?
So, Christian, first of all, you're an amazing character yourself, I should say, and you've done a tremendous number of interviews. So my first reaction when you reached out was, why does he want to talk to me? And yes, a lot of interesting people in the world. But here's the big answer to your question, and then we can unpack it. The big answer to your question is you have to be at a point in your life with all the life experiences you've had, and you have to have a podium to make change. If nobody is listening to you, you can't do anything. Often people will listen to you because you have money. Very often they listen to you if you're a business leader that also has a philosophy. So I've always argued with all my cohorts, many of whom have become very successful, that they are extremely lucky to be business leaders, to have financial independence, and to have that podium. What is a podium? A podium is not a standard, go on a stage and stand behind something and look out at an audience. It's like you, a voice, something that can be propagated. Now, once you get to that place, what is it you want to talk about? How do you want to influence other people's thinking? It's not about yourself. First lesson learned, if it's about yourself, people will stop paying attention after about 42 and a half seconds. If it's about other people and it's not relevant to them, they'll also stop paying attention. It takes about 3 minutes. But if you're talking about something that's very universal, where people feel a connection, they're going to listen to you, and then they're going to want to hear solutions, and maybe they will become part of whatever you're trying to create. So my passion, and we can unpack how it got there, is affordable housing. I truly believe that if every person on earth and every person in America had housing stability, a place they called home and a place that they believe is stable, that the rest of the country, and somehow that will create a level playing field for them to have and take advantage of whatever God-given talents they have. And I have therefore dedicated my podiums and my opportunities with wealth or with expertise or with access to making sure that that singular goal is met. And I feel like it's really simple, it's extraordinarily complicated, and it'll take trillions of dollars to do. So unpacking it, you start with where your life was, what's the most important thing that came to you, how do you take advantage of the opportunities presented, and then you count yourself as very lucky if you have both financial independence, expertise, and a podium, and how you use it then really materially affects how the rest of the world lives.
What I find so interesting is the value that you bring, and like you mentioned in regards to like the podium, like when you are a business leader, when you have a platform, a podium, like you mentioned, you say you got to use it for good. You got to use it to make an impact. You got to use it to share your message and what you stand for. And looking at your life, because when we talked offline prior to this podcast, you mentioned how the way you look at that kind of podium structure in regards to what you just mentioned, you said you apply that to your business, you apply that to kind of where you're at now, but where did that evolve to, or when did that kind of come to fruition? Because I do know you mentioned your grandfather was also part of Mahatma Gandhi, and was with the freedom fighters. And I'd love to unpack that. Do you feel like you got your inspiration from there, or was that always just your personality, Shekar?
Yes, and we are all, I think genetic research has proved that we come from somewhere, and we always connect to our past, whether we recognize it or not. My grandfather was a freedom fighter, the editor of the first major English daily in India in the 1920s, an extraordinarily individual who knew how to communicate. And because of that singular ability to be able to communicate and have this value system, he invented a whole terminology around independence and the movement and how you motivate other people. And it was in a very extraordinarily narrow and elitist way, because less than 10% of Indians at that time would have understood English. So how he took that and translated it into words in other languages that people understood and resonated stuck with me. But the concept of sacrificing everything about yourself for a larger and bigger good, and taking that kind of risk, in fact, made me start to think of a word that is often used, but rarely in the context of public service, which is how to be a political entrepreneur. Namely, how in a world where people essentially tend to want Christian to be very coached, very thoughtful, highly regulated in how they say what they say because of the amount of exposure they have, they tend to be extraordinarily careful about ever expressing any emotions. If you really want to have an impact on people's lives, you have to feel passionate about it. It seems it starts with that. So how did we ever get to the stage? So in the independence movement, it was really simple. It was independence. It was throwing off the shackles of, at that time, like in America, the British, making sure that you had a country that became self-reliant. I learned from that experience, yes, public service is in my veins, the concept of it. But what didn't ever get into my veins until Kentucky, until my experiences living in eastern Kentucky in the coal fields 40 years ago, when it would have been very difficult to have recognized me and seen me as, how did I belong there even? Was recognizing that there was this government, and in this case it was federal government primarily, that was investing in lifting up places that had high poverty, that had a huge mineral extraction, and very limited at that time resources on the human talent level. And unfortunately, it's changed a lot, but it hasn't changed enough. But the reason it is generational. So I concluded from that experience that, and I worked in housing there. I worked in communities which in those days, in 1975, there were counties in eastern Kentucky where 80% of the homes did not have running water or access to sewage inside the home. It sounds almost unbelievable. This was America. the richest country on earth that had won World War II, saved the planet, blah, 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 sent men to the moon, and yet so many people in America didn't even have indoor plumbing. And so you start with solving those little problems, the idea of giving people hygiene, better education about healthcare, and so on. And everything revolved around a house, having a place to call home and living. So I learned in Kentucky, pride and giving people autonomy was important. The government can create that platform, that opportunity, but it can also create enormous generational dependencies. And if it does do that, it can destroy the human talent piece while it's providing for basic necessities. This is like having a car without gas, or without electric power. You can't drive it, but it looks really nice when it sits in your driveway. And what was happening was that there were many communities in America getting left behind that either had cars and no gas, or in the case of places like Appalachia and Eastern Kentucky, had lots of mineral resources but weren't able to keep the human talent to build self-reliant economies. And the government was not the solution. The solution was the private sector. So build the opportunity, give people pride, recognize that the government can be good and it can also create counterproductive negative effects, solve for the problem that exists, and then the private sector has to take over and create the jobs, the talent skilling, the opportunities, and then those that are willing to invest and work hard. And by the way, this country was built by immigrants. I'm not going to make any bold claims, but I came to this country with $200 in my pocket. I had a ticket, a one-way ticket. I had an opportunity to go study. And yes, I came from some privilege because at least I could buy the ticket and I didn't have debt at that point. But little did I realize my father had taken a loan just to get the ticket. And only later he admitted that to me, that this was an important thing for him to do because it's something I needed and wanted to do. But you feel this enormous obligation to succeed. It's a little bit like Christian saying to yourself, I do not have the option of failure, i.e. I must succeed at some level. There was no incentive like that in many parts of Appalachia, and where the government had stepped in, provided a floor and said, you can't fail. That's not how people succeed. People have to have the option of failure and the option of success, but they can be given basic necessities and a safety net. So they can't fall too far and become a burden themselves or themselves not have the chance to succeed. I learned this. I learned that housing was integral to it. And it then translated over once I became a business person and I moved beyond my young age and I'd grown older and I realized, oh my goodness, if I'm going to run a company and I'm going to have hundreds of employees and offices all over the country, what am I going to do with that when I stand up and I'm asked to speak? If I do an interview with an editorial board, am I just going to talk about my company, my numbers, my next quarter, how much growth there is, how excited I am about, ABC? Or am I also going to say, you know what, and as a company, we have a real dedication to addressing some of the issues that face the communities that we work in. And one of those is, so in every one of our 18 offices, we used to have a placard as you entered. By the way, this is a commercial real estate finance company, okay? So you entered and it had a quote from the 1949 Housing Act passed by the U.S. Congress. And the quote essentially says, every American has the right to safe, decent, and sustainable housing. Just a little paragraph. It's the clipboard of what many people in the housing arena have said was something that the Congress codified in 1949. Unrealized dream, like much of our Constitution has things in it that, are aspirational, as they should be, because you're trying to create a living document. This was a living document. People would walk into our office, clients and others, and read it and say, what does that have to do with the company and what it does? And what we said was, I'll tell you what it does. It tells all the people who work here that we have actually a mission that's much larger than ourselves. Also, of the billions of dollars of loans we were making each year, we would absolutely prioritized making loans in communities that were being left behind, in affordable housing, and our track record in doing that was as good, if not better, than doing traditional lending. And we wanted to prove that it's profitable and makes sense and provides mission and purpose. If you do that, so you can create a really great company, not just a company that works on quarterly earnings. So that's how I brought it together into the business life before I embarked on other things once I sold my company.
Well, it's so powerful because, like you mentioned, Shekar, you're saying that yes, there's the nonprofits, and yes, there are those government institutions that are beneficial to some extent, but you have to put it into realize that like you mentioned, the free enterprise, the capitalism world side of things, it helps actually more impactful, definitely if you structure it the correct way, and you're basically leveraging this and say it could, because those other platforms or those verticals, they just move too slow. And they may not actually incentivize the right behavior. And so this actually helps facilitate, and it's okay to monetize it. Now, let me ask you this in regards to, because you gave a really good example in the real estate world, right? Opportunity zones, we're seeing that.
Yes.
We're obviously in the housing, which is incredible. I do know the opportunity zone kind of, and I know we're going to get a little micro here, but I know that law or that kind of regulation is kind of dwindling away. Do you feel like that would be good to revive and into the consistently and push it forward? Because I saw some massive capital allocated toward opportunity zones that help facilitate the right incentive. So I was just curious, just on that note there, what is your opinion on that?
Right idea, wrong execution. Very often, good policy, the way good policy gets made is you try something out and then you adjust it a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later. We are now in a very divisive environment, ramming through stuff, doing it one way, and then we never change it even if it's not working. So we have to declare black or white. It's working, it's not working. Well, you know what? It's working somewhat. In the Opportunity Zone Fund we set up, after extensive research, we determined that there were roughly 8,000 small towns, less than 100,000 in population, that had completely gone to the wayward because of the loss of jobs. And that what happened to these towns, which used to be vibrant communities, America was not in the 1900s a community of millions of people in large cities. It was actually hundreds of thousands of people in lots of small cities. And that's what changed fundamentally after the Industrial Revolution was many of these places thrived, but they needed to have natural resources. Either they had coal extraction or they had a river for transportation and so on. But the industries that created them, like textile and furniture, all disappeared. They became competed with, and there's a lot of rhetoric about China and the Communist Party and what it did, but essentially America did nothing to protect itself and didn't protect these small towns. So what happened was these towns went from 200,000 population to 30,000. Guess who stayed and guess who left? One of my measurement standards for a vibrancy of a community is how many young people under the age of 30 are moving back. Seems like it would be very logical criteria to actually measure, because if a town starts to deteriorate, it loses social services, education, all the vibrancy downtown. It loses the reasons why young people live and want to bring their families up and grow, because it doesn't give them the opportunity. So when you measure these towns, they were getting older, they were getting grayer, they were becoming less vibrant, and any chance, we did a survey once in Southwest Virginia in the mountains, and basically 8 out of 10 eighth graders said, the first thing I'm going to do when I get my GED is leave. What does that say to you about the community and its potential for the future, right? Because these people, that's what they're thinking about, that my life, my opportunity set. So you have to fundamentally change that. Opportunity zones came in and said, here are communities that have been underinvested for a long time, for whatever reason. In the case of what we selected was towns that had downtowns that didn't have any vibrancy, young people had left, but they had natural elements that made them potentially very successful. You could see the seeds of change, but they had only just been planted. Some private sector capital to create vibrancy in the downtown, restaurants, a little bit of a nightlife, safety with better lighting, improvements in the police force, a little better planning. The story of the revitalization of Durham, North Carolina is what motivated us. Because what happened in Durham was less than 25 years ago in Durham, Duke used to tell its students, you can go up to this point, but don't go further. Because 80% of downtown was essentially empty and therefore quite dangerous. In less than 20 years, with lots of investment, most of it private, a small amount of public investment, an enlightened government that stepped out of the way once it had a plan and a vision, and huge private sector engagement, you have a vibrant community where people want to live, work, thrive, bring up families, and grow. Can be done. We said, if that can be done, can we pick 5 places and do it, and we'll succeed in 3, fail in 1, hopefully do okay in the 5th, because we're talking about people's lives here, not just money. And that's what we embarked on. Now, I guess my point is that if it hadn't been for opportunity zones, we probably wouldn't have launched it. Did we need all those tax incentives to make it work? No. Did we need government? Yes. Did we need private sector? Yes. Did we need nonprofit and social institutions? Yes. So the same ingredients of success, whether you change the tax laws to make it advantageous or not, apply. But the most important thesis was it can be done. We did a case study of one town, and it was raving. Now, it's early days. It takes 5. If something declines for 20, 25 years, it doesn't rebound and come back in 2 years. You have to measure it over a 5-year period. And how many people in America have patience for that? So we're measuring, and we'll tell you later if we're succeeding. But if we do succeed, our mission wasn't to go out and raise yet another fund and do it 6 more times. It was to broadcast what the ingredients of success and failure had been, and hand that blueprint to other small towns of 100,000, 200,000 in size, and say, if you decide to do this and want to do it, here are some things you should do and not do, and here's how you can succeed. Because I truly believe that it doesn't matter where you live, and maybe COVID taught us this, it's not where you live, it's who you are. But there has to be a playing field that's somewhat level that gives you the opportunity to succeed. So, frankly, Christian, I think America is the greatest country on earth, but it's failing a very significant portion of its population because it is not giving them that same level of opportunity. And if your zip code starts to dictate whether you are successful or a failure, as a country, we're not succeeding. And that's what I talk about a lot more today than I've ever talked about, is where and why opportunity sets are being created so disproportionately in this country.
Well, you've said so much there that's so valuable. And what I love about what you mentioned here is it's like you're taking a very large problem and you're able to reverse engineer it and identify what are those key things, those big domino effect that will obviously help facilitate the right direction and set these individuals that are in these communities in these situations to be able to set them on the right foundation to bounce into really good opportunities and so forth. So I love how you just able to really take that. I was listening to someone the other day and they were able to identify, individuals, kids that are 11 to 15, that is where, there's a lot of development that really happens. Your beliefs, your trauma, certain things that happen that really are the key aspects of future situations or whatever, beliefs and the way your behaviors and so forth. And I found that very interesting because once you're able to identify that, like what you're basically saying, once you're able to identify it, then you're able to go right directly to those communities and those environments and say, okay, well, how do we change this in the proper way and have this partnership with government and private to be able to make this beautiful synergistic relationship? I want to ask a little bit, Shekar, because I've had conversations with business owners. They've got a lot of resources. Some of our audience, they're taking dividends and they want to get into politics of some sort. They want to get impact at that level, right? Because they see the importance of it. But what really stops them is like, I don't want to bring my whole family into the political realm because it's tough, right? It's a tough game, whether you're running for a treasury or local or national level, whichever vertical that may be. And I found this very interesting because I think we need more people in that. But I love your approach to it. You don't say, hey, let's just run for politics on the front end. Your strategy really is really creating almost like a five-finger approach. There's been a lot of different ways. You're part of nonprofits. You're developing political organizations, kind of things. You're investing in your family foundation. There's certain capital that you're allocated. There's a lot of different way that you structured your reach and your impact in a very strategic approach. And Shekar, I would love for you to just maybe share, if you could, share your thesis, share your kind of the structure organizationally for our audience to say, hey, this is a different approach, unorthodox in maybe the way you think about it, but it's still an amazing approach where you can make your impact, but maybe don't have to run for these things that will, put a microscope underneath your family and so forth. So I'd love for you to just touch on that a little bit, Shekar.
Sure. And so let me do this in two ways. One is, what is politics? Politics and the reason for even engaging in it. Every one of us, business people, is affected by politics. And I know we like to deny it. And a lot of people come to me and say, well, I hate politics. And I go, yes, but didn't you have to get zoning and permitting approval for your last building? But what is that? Who gave you the approval to do what you did? What about the water and sewer systems and the air we breathe and the road you travel on? Anyway, so what is politics? Politics is inherently at the end of the day, very personal. It affects business. It affects life. Now, but how do you translate that into anything? And why even engage in it? Well, the only reason is I could go and work in 5 small towns, dedicate my entire fortune, time, and everything and say, I'm going to make change. And I could affect potentially 1,000 people's lives. Now, a lot of people say that's a lot of lives. That's fantastic. That's great. I agree. But if I had the opportunity and again that podium, I would like to affect 100,000 people's lives, maybe 1 million people's lives. How do you do that? The only party in the world, in any country, in any situation that can scale like that is the government. It's the only way you can scale something to a level where in policy you can say, take this great idea and let's do it at 100 places or 1,000 places. And by the way, yes, there'll be mistakes made and this is where the political risk taking takes place. Can you convince, as a business person, people to take the risk to do things where the odds of success are high, but there's also odds of failure? And that's what a business person brings to the table, is that ability to translate. Now, final piece of this is that what is politics and policy? You don't get policy without people. So the right people have to be elected in order to enact the policies, which then leads to the outcomes that you and I want. So therefore, it gets back to, if I'm a business person, I have to help elect the right people. Now, do I only elect people who agree with everything I think and therefore just sort of mouth everything I say and my own vision of the future? The answer is you won't find those people. You'll find people who agree with you 64% of the time and disagree 36%. You'll find people who agree with you half the time. You choose in politics always the lesser of all evils. You pick, it's not a perfect world. So you say to yourself, it's not about holding your nose. It's about now you want to empower this change in that politician who agrees with you half the time. How do you do that? 3 ways. You can give them money, which is the traditional, I call it the most passive way to do it. Now, the reason it is less passive than it used to be is disclosure laws. If you write a check today in a public way for a $250 donation, your name is published somewhere. And when you go to Open Secrets, you can find your name and other people will start bombarding you who think, hey, if he gave him $250, he's going to give me $250 too. And you suddenly get overwhelmed with all this noise, which actually, frankly, is very distracting. You can also, and many people have discovered this, donate in a way to nonprofits and others that don't have to disclose. But you know what? Your ego will stand in the way of that because you don't mind going actually and showing up and being known as a donor and getting a picture with the candidate. So it turns out that the world has evolved to the place where you're going to be known as a donor. So even though you may not be saying anything much or doing much more than that, the fact is now that you're engaged in politics. But why not do more if you have a bully pulpit or a platform, which is talk to that person about your issues. I care passionately that good shelter and good strong communities are the reason why America will be a great country and is a great country. Therefore, I'm going to talk to that person about that. And I want to know that the resources they're thinking about should go into places like that and be invested in a wise manner. And I'm going to talk about the private sector's role in that and say, don't do things that only the government does. Do things to leverage private capital so that there's accountability. And then the third thing, once I get from I'm now in politics, I'm in policy, I care about people, is can you actually help effectuate the policy? The way policy gets effectuated, just so you and I know and level set for your audience, 9 out of 10 bills that have ever passed Congress were not written necessarily by the author of the bill. It came from somewhere else. So it came from either a senator or a representative's life experience, but it usually came from a trade association or a lobbying group or somebody else who had a vested interest in the outcome and said, I'm going to spend the time, do the research, write the legislation, negotiate with hundreds of people, and present this to a representative that we help to elect, and that person is going to introduce it and then convince a larger body to adopt it. If you're a businessman and you care passionately about an issue, why aren't you involved in writing it then? That, by the way, is the ultimate form of engagement. From my perspective, I've taken it one step further. I found that a very large number of people, particularly Asian American voters, and those who were eligible to vote were not participating in the political process at all. Forget about writing a check. Forget about influencing policy or supporting candidates. They weren't even registering to vote. So a God-given right in America is, when you turn 18, you're a citizen, you have the right to vote. It's an amazing right. Because think about it, it comes with some responsibility. Evaluate the candidates, evaluate what they stand for, and go vote for the one you care about, right? This is how we vest ourselves in the system. So in the highest turnout election in modern history, in 2020, 68% of Americans chose to vote. After billions were spent trying to get them to vote. That means, by the way, 32% chose not to vote. Do you know that's almost 100 million people? Now, of 100 million people, Christian, I can easily argue that on a given day, a third of them either don't feel well, are sick, or have work and can't do whatever it is they're supposed to do. So let's say 33 million had an excuse. I had a headache, I couldn't get out of bed, I wasn't feeling well, I couldn't stand in line. Another third didn't even know what voting was. It was voting day, election day. Nobody talked to them about it either. And another third said, politics stinks. I came from a country which was, authoritarian. My vote never counted. It doesn't really make any difference. The cynicism factor. And they don't vote. But think about the opportunity lost in America when a third of the population has decided that it doesn't really matter. Nothing changes. So I said, you know what? I got to find out who that third is. I got to know something about this 32%. And it has been even worse in history. We had an election just now in 2022 where about half the people voted. The other half chose, like, hey, it's not worth my time. So I have focused on voting, increasing voting power, which is you've got to educate people on the value of voting. You have to make it easier for them to vote. You have to work on laws and policies that enable that. But then for what reason? To elect candidates who agree with their values, and then have those candidates go and actually do something with the power that they're now vested with. Then turn back around to those voters and say, you know what you did? You did this, this, this. Your one vote, that 2 hours you spent, or 15 minutes or 4 hours, resulted in this, and this impacted your life, potentially the life of your children and grandchildren. That's the reason you should participate. There's only one country in the world, and it's mandatory voting. They fine you if you don't. In a real democracy, Australia, over 90% of the people vote. That's a country where I would say people have vested in, they can hate their politicians, but you know what? They did something about putting them in office. So they have a responsibility to hold them accountable. In our system, we are so detached at the end from the outcomes that we don't see that relevance. So for me, the whole act of political giving became educate donors about what to ask for, find candidates who share your values, build an organization, therefore, and organizations, and support them with registration drives, citizenship drives, because at the end, America is only strong when everybody has an opportunity. And that should include the opportunity to a job and a livelihood and growth, but also a responsibility to vote. And it is a travesty that we don't spend enough time on this. And you know what, business leaders? We had one major bank leader who on the day of the election in 2020 chose to give everybody on his entire building, office building, 8,000 employees, a couple of hours of grace to go vote. He didn't tell them who to vote for. He just said, you should know it. The lines are long. I know it's going to take some time, but I think, there are many countries in which the day of voting is actually a national holiday to encourage voting. We don't do any of those things in this country. If anything, there are many states that think that you should do things to make it harder to vote, which makes no sense whatsoever. So that's my, political lineage leading to what I do today. And I talk to business leaders every day and say, this is not partisan. This is about your livelihood and the opportunity set. But I can't imagine why you would not be standing up and saying, we should enable everybody to have the power to vote. We should educate them that they know what they're voting for. And we should be willing to stand up in front of them. But my final comment is that everybody who gets into politics has to have a reason. Because this is going to be, there's something in your gut that's telling you to do this. Most often, people assume that it's something you want. It's personal. I'm afraid, and yes, in a crass world, I would argue, you want something, of course. Why would you do anything? Get out of bed if you didn't have something you wanted to accomplish. I made the choice that I didn't want to run for office, so I could be categorical about that, because people say, well, aren't you going to run for office? That I wasn't going to seek a position, that I wasn't going to put my name in and become a platitudinal title, to go for an honorific or a title, and that if nothing, this wasn't so much because it could negate that general feeling of the only reason he's doing all this is because he wants something. Or it's this inherent power that you can call people up and you have access. The fundamental reason was I wanted to take that argument away from working with me. I wanted people not to have to think for more than 5 seconds and say, I'm doing this with him, but then, he's going to want something out of it. So how do you become not selfless? Because I don't view that word as, I'm not selfless. I have every reason to want to do what I do, but I don't do it only for myself. And by not doing it only for myself and proving that over, a long period of time, 17 years of my engagement in this, then people say, well, okay, I might be able to join with him. And even if I have slightly different motives, if we accomplish it together, we'll be better. So I hope I answered your question, but there's a real opportunity for everybody to participate at some level.
You did, and I really appreciate you going into depth on that. And because I am a big believer, I've talked to so many people, and it's like they have that heart and that passion for it. But it's like one of the things one of my biggest pet peeves is like, I don't watch the news. I don't really pay attention to any of this. And the reality is, if you don't pay attention at the national or the local level, you really can't complain when something doesn't go your way, whether, like you mentioned, zoning laws or regulations or, Board of Education, et cetera, right? When they're passing these things, and you're not part of the conversation, right? If you are not intentional with this. And that's the reason why I love your approach, because the way you look at it is there is a responsibility, right? I have the ability to vote. I have the right to vote. It is my responsibility to vote, right? Whether it's left or right, whichever way it is, but the reality is you have this responsibility. And like you mentioned, the U.S., you're only getting 50% activity. Majority of them are not, right? And depending upon what year that is. And it is very sad to see, but I love your approach in regards to, hey, making sure that it is simplifying, but also making sure that we educate and really sharing the importance and the responsibility. Say, hey, this is this is a responsibility for us to, make our change and make that impact. I was talking to somebody the other day, and we were, many years ago, actually, it was funny, and we were discussing about politics. And then I said, well, who did you vote? She goes, well, I didn't vote. I said, well, I can't even have a conversation about politics if you don't even, not even having your own opinion in this matter. So it's just so funny about this. I want to ask you on this as well. This is something I found very intriguing. I want to, Shekar, I think there's a lot of politicians, and I understand their context. Right, they want to keep getting voted in, and the way to do that is you got to align your beliefs, your platform, for your voters, right, your constituents, so that they vote you back in. And sometimes by doing that, you have to be a chameleon. I always like to kind of associate a good analogy. And so sometimes that politician, that may not be their belief, and that may not be like what they truly, truly that their heart is exemplifying, but they have to associate or align themselves with their constituents. So Shekar, throughout your journey, how do you, regardless of culturally, regardless of other individuals' opinion, how do you stay integrous with your belief, with your vision, with who you are, and you show up regardless of, hey, 90% of people will say this, but you stand here alone sometimes, naked and afraid, but you have to say, you know what? This is my vision. This is my integrity. This is who I am. And regardless of everybody else agreeing with this thing, sometimes as a leader, you have to, and sometimes definitely in the political world, you have to stand alone, but you have to stand for something. And instead of being a chameleon and aligning with your constituents and say, no, right, this is where we're going. This is the right thing. And I think you mentioned this offline, but I loved it. It's not about being correct, but finding the truth. And I thought that was really very valuable in today's culture. So I'd love for you to just touch on that for us, Shekar.
Sure. So Christian, I think the most challenging thing for a politician is to actually agree with another different point of view that he didn't or she didn't espouse during a campaign. Or as you say, if your base voted for something and wants you to keep supporting it and they are the most vocal, what we need to understand is that the extremes represent less than 10 or 15% of the people. That the vast majority of people, it's well more than 50%, are probably in the middle on most issues. So what is the job of a leader? Is to follow the 10% or the 15% that are the most vocal, that pound the doors, that make the most noise, that send the most tweets? What? Or is it to try to listen to the vast majority and shape their opinion? So I'll give you a classic example. On the issue, for example, which is a highly controversial issue of guns. There is a question, there are three questions. There's a constitutional question about the fact that there is a right to bear arms in our Constitution. It's called the Second Amendment. There is a second, which is that right can and should be limited to protect the public safety of all. And how that regulation is done. Because the Constitution says a well-regulated militia. So well-regulated means law, policy, practice, enforcement. But there's a third, which is ideological, which is, I'll be damned if you tell me what to do, all the way to how can you possibly have people walking around carrying, rifles in the streets. So in that very diametric, divided, if you will, by the way, with both sides having some stake in it, and there is a belief system in both sides, what does the vast majority of your constituents actually want? How do you find that middle ground? How do you start talking about it as a leader? And then how do you slowly, incrementally change attitudes enough to pass laws that are meaningful and prevent unnecessary deaths? Okay? And the answer is it can be done, takes a long time, but how can any one politician or two or three or a small caucus accomplish this without the backbone support of communities that have influence with them? That middle. I view myself very much in that middle, frankly. I view most of the business leaders I associate with mostly in that middle. What if 100 CEOs got together and said, we want sensible gun reform? Here are the elements and principles of that. Do you know there'll be hundreds of politicians that would like to stand behind that, not in front of it? Because if they wrote it, they would get attacked from all sides and they would lose their next election. Let's be fair. A CEO doesn't come into a job with the intention of screwing it up and getting fired publicly on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. That's not what you do. It'd be like that. You're asking them to take a risk that they can't individually take. Can you give them the backbone to take it? And then find out who has character and integrity and can step up with you? And then patiently work the system to accomplish those goals? Yes. So is it clear to some that things can be changed and that we cannot afford to have, what have we had, 39 mass shootings involving firearms just in the last 34 days of this year, 33 days. How sustainable is that for a society that you can't walk on the street and not fear this? Why is it that we have it and other countries don't? So let's have a rational discussion, but it's not a rational discussion because it's wholly ideological. My argument is the role of the business community is to support those people who are willing to stand with you, but recognize there are times they can't step in front and, quote, lead. It's your job to help them lead. And sometimes it means you have to stand in front of them. And you mentioned something early on, and I've said, so there is a truth here. The truth is that most people want to be safe. Some people feel that they are safer if they're protecting themselves. Some people feel safer if they are protected from others. And that's the fundamental difference in that one issue. But the truth is that most people want some kind of a sensible regulatory system that's enforced fairly for everyone. And we can find that in this country. We have fought many battles and many wars. We've lost thousands of people who fought for our freedom. We should be prepared to have those fights without having to shoot each other in order to have an outcome that's desirable. And business leaders, people who have a voice, people who have that podium, have the responsibility to do it. And I view that as so fundamentally a civic duty that I don't know how to say it. How can you not do that? Now, can you do this running a major corporation? When you're speaking about your shareholders and your stakeholders? Probably not. Because if you do, you will be attacked on all sides. Your stock price may go down, your board will fire you. It's like saying to a politician, go out and say something really important but highly controversial, and you'll be fired from your job the next week. All right? You can't expect that. What you can expect is that they will retire, they will be financially independent, and rather than vacationing in the Bahamas and putting their money in the Caymans, maybe they can stand up and start talking about the issues that affect their children and their grandchildren, and give the backbone to the politicians who want to serve the vast majority of people to accomplish these changes that are necessary.
Well, I love your approach because it's so pragmatic, and like you mentioned, political, because they want to get in power. They obviously use the radical on both sides to be able to get the power and to push their ideology. And like you mentioned, I love what you said. That was such a beautiful synopsis and thesis in regards to what's going on right now, what we're seeing, and we do need leaders that are not afraid to stand up and have a pragmatic approach and say these are these tough issues, whether it's healthcare, whether it's gun, whether it's whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And having these conversations and find a pragmatic, because like you mentioned, majority of Americans are in that. If you talk to anybody, liberal or conservative, and you start just having a dialogue, it's actually very interesting. I've had a lot of conversations. I'm like, oh, I assumed that this is what you believe, but when you start actually asking them, then you're able to say, oh, we actually kind of align in regards to we need to solve this, but maybe the approach might be different, and the approach can be synergistic in nature. Shekar, I really appreciate your stance on this, the way you are the forefront of this, and that's why it was just so fun to have you on and having this conversation. For those that are listening, to really think about this, implementing this approach, and making sure that you are intentional, make sure you are active. Like you mentioned, hey, you know what? You're not just bouncing your last check and going to the Cayman Islands and saying, I'm out of here, adios. No, it's being able to say, hey, what's that next leadership, right? You're on the mountain, you've got resources, you've got connections, you've got ability, you got amazing Rolodex. How do I now add value and really impact at that next level? Shekar, for those that want to be part of what you got going on, or maybe listen, or maybe just reach out to you and engage with what you got going on, how do they reach out to you, my man?
Sure. Well, if they go to the website, the Beekman Advisors, they can find me, or if they go to the political organization I founded called the AAPI Victory Fund, they can find out what we've done on the political side. And in every single case, I would argue that if I were anything, it's centrist, and maybe I'm a little center left in social beliefs, and you might be a little center right on social beliefs, but we're going to be able to find middle ground. Now, if your mind has been completely poisoned and it's about disinformation, you will probably simply attack me. But let me mention the one risk people take in this that does get stated and is a worry, and how you mitigate that. Your family needs to be with you when you do this. And the reason is that I can go through episodes in my own life and my sons when we became very exposed, and there was hate mail, but there were threats made. And we live in a society where that has become commonplace because so much is anonymous today in social media. So people are bolder to express themselves than they would be if they had to stand in front of you, look you in the eye and say something, you see? And so I get that there is a perceived risk there. I will say this, there's risk in crossing a road, in getting on a plane. There's risk in, speaking your mind on anything. There's risk in politics. What you need to do is sit down and have that conversation with your family as well and tell them to be prepared. But of the thousands of things that emails, communications, and otherwise that I've seen, I would say on average, less than 3% were in that category of vindictive, accusatory, and so on. So it's a very small, it again gave me hope. You could argue, by God, look at the vitriol here and get all upset about that. But then I also weigh that against the 997 that was saying, thank God you're stepping out and you're standing up and you're talking about this. And it's just a matter of make sure that your family knows that 3% exists, that there is some risk, and make sure they feel themselves protected, if you embark on this. But I don't see how any public figure, whether it is a public company CEO or a politician or someone running any major organization, civic or otherwise, does not have that exposure. I just think you have it, you don't realize it. By saying something controversial, you haven't exacerbated, just bring your family along with you on that ride. And yet you'll find the vast majority of people in the universe tend to want to see things improve, get better. They want more for their children and their grandchildren. That's just universal. So if you start with that universality, it's so much easier to function than starting with it's vitriolic and I have to split screen Fox and CNN in order to get some view in the middle or something. That's exactly the opposite way to look at it. The right way to look at it is it doesn't matter what I'm listening to and talking to. I grew up, I have a value system. I should be able to talk about it openly. Just bring along with you your family, your friends, your network. And as you do, you'll find the support base is 95, 97% in favor of what you're doing. And that's vindication enough.
Such powerful, powerful wisdom on that. And I love what you said there, because it is the importance of you're not giving any power to those that are naysayers, those anonymous things, because there always will be. And it's like, hey, I'm going to go drive and do what you do and have the responsibility, because you see that the positive outweigh the negatives by a 10-to-1 ratio, which is incredible. Shekar, what incredible wisdom. Guys, those links to reach out to engage with what he's got going on. He's got a Wikipedia, he's got his LinkedIn. I'll put his website down there, all down in the description below. So make sure you stop what you're doing, and just reach out to him. Understand how you can, partake, understand how you can learn and maybe implement certain things that he's been able to be on the forefront of. Shekar, again, I really appreciate you just sharing your wisdom and your knowledge and your journey throughout this. I know we could riff on this quite a bit. Guys, that is my guest, the managing partner at Beekman Advisors, Shekar Narasimhan. Guys, that is Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast. Until next time, be uncommon if you can.
Thank you.